In the Soviet Union, everyone knew the phrase, if you don't work, you don't eat. But it had another version too. If you don't work, you go to jail. Yes, in 1961, a law was passed on parasitism, or the law on parasitic lifestyle, which stated the following. If you don't work for 4 months, you'll be sent to forced labor for a year or exiled for 2 years to Siberia, where you'll also be bringing benefit to the state. This was a unique law that was in effect for 3 decades of Soviet history. How it was applied, who suffered from it, let's talk about that today. The most notorious case under the parasitism law was the case against poet Joseph Brodsky. In 1964, in Leningrad, there was a trial of 24-year-old poet Joseph Brodsky. When the judge asked him, "Who told you that you're a poet?" he boldly replied, "And who says I'm human?" In the end, he was sentenced to 5 years of exile. He was sent to Arkhangelsk region, where he dug earth, herded cows, and slept in a freezing barracks. He jokingly wrote to his friends, "Now I'm a poet in boots, and my muse has a shovel." Yes, in the Soviet Union, an unemployed poet was considered a parasite. International outcry forced the Soviet Union to release Joseph Brodsky, and he spent a year and a half in exile. After which he emigrated, received the Nobel Prize, but in the Soviet Union, he was still a parasite poet. There were many such cases in the Soviet Union. The famous film director Andrei Tarkovsky, who created such cinematic masterpieces as Andrei Rublev, Stalker, Mirror, received awards at Cannes and Venice film festivals, was still considered a parasite in the Soviet Union. Since his works were shelved and weren't shown anywhere in the country, he refused to film what he was recommended to film. But when he received the warning that either he would work or be sent into exile to Siberia, he was forced to emigrate. I know this sounds strange, but let me give you an example. Take Quentin Tarantino. In all this time, he's made 9 films. Now imagine if he lived in the Soviet Union, then despite being a very wealthy person with no need to work, he still would have been sent to labor camps in Siberia. Seems like a great plot for a new film. So, Mr. Quentin Tarantino, give us a call. This law mostly affected creative people, poets, writers, singers, since everything in the Soviet Union was centralized. And any song performer, writer, artist had to officially register and be part of writers' unions, artists' unions, the State Philharmonic. But if you wanted to create freely, you had to find a way out somehow. Therefore, the most popular jobs among creative people were stoker, security guard, janitor positions. These gave you the opportunity to both work and pursue your passion. There was one case when a neighbor came to an already well-known rock musician in certain circles and said, "You are facing exile, the parasitism law, and we need a stoker in our courtyard." Back then, many buildings didn't have central heating yet, and each had its own boiler room. He listened to him, got a job as a stoker. And at night, stokers usually worked at night. Real bohemian life began there. Poets, writers, musicians would gather there, who in this small boiler room held concerts and drank. In general, the nights were very noisy. Neighbors started complaining, started calling the police. Police would come, they'd break it up. But when neighbors said, "Prosecute him," they'd say, "What for? He works, he's not a parasite," and he continued working. There were many such cases. The famous poet, singer, actor Vladimir Vysotsky, the beloved bard and performer Bulat Okudjava, they all faced the threat of exile to Siberia. Because if you didn't have this kind of workbook, the Soviet Union coat of arms, "This is my workbook," and it didn't have a record that you were working, then that's it. Within 4 months, you'd be sent to Siberia. They spared no one. Even if a mother who gave birth to a child didn't want to go back to work after that, because her husband could provide for her, she still faced the threat of this law. I had this experience in my own life. I was 17 years old, had just finished school, I had been a strong student, but I was applying to an institute where competition was 200 people for a single place. I didn't get in, and even though my parents could have supported me until next year's admission to the institute, they didn't have the slightest doubt, and within 2 weeks, I was working as a nurse in the somatic department of a children's city hospital. And despite being only 17 years old, it was very difficult, both physically and emotionally demanding work. I still worked for a year and prepared for admission to the institute. But in the end, I did get in. So nobody in the Soviet Union had the slightest doubt that you had to work. Nobody had the option to live off someone else, lie around on the couch, because they would come for you and arrest you. Even ladies, generals' wives or wives of some party officials, yes, they didn't actually work, but if they showed their workbook, it would say, cleaning lady, maintenance worker, janitor, because they still had to be registered somewhere. Such was the law. Of course, now this law looks like a tragic comedy, because famous poets, writers, directors, philosophers were forced to leave the Soviet Union solely because of this law. And if they were world-renowned figures somewhere, in their homeland, they were still listed as parasites. What do you think about this? It really makes you think. Because on one hand, indeed, there was no opportunity to create, philosophize, create something beautiful, because probably only in freedom can you do this. But on the other hand, this law didn't allow people who truly didn't want to work, who preferred to lie on the couch and just use their relatives who would be forced to support them. Write about this in the comments and let's debate this issue. In general, the parasitism law was quite heavily propagandized in the Soviet Union. Many satirical films were made everywhere in newspapers and magazines. There were constantly cartoons on this topic, party meetings were held, raids were conducted. And Soviet people had no opportunity whatsoever to avoid bringing benefit to the Soviet state. On YouTube, there are many channels about the Soviet Union, but I can say with certainty that our channel is unique. We create it with our own efforts. We don't have any sponsors. This is our life. We simply tell about our life in the Soviet Union, and this kind of truth is really rare. And we want to tell as much about it as possible. I'm currently undergoing treatment, and I have several surgeries ahead, but I'll still try not to stop filming. And so I have a big request. Subscribe to our channel, give it a like, write comments so these videos reach as many people as possible. And of course, if you have the opportunity, support us on Patreon. And a big thank you to those who already support us. This was Julie, Soviet Born Channel.
И до новых встреч!